Okay, yeah, it's working. Mm, okay, thanks, man. So again, like good morning, everyone. So today, what we will be covering is data types of Python, and if time permits, we will cover operators in Python. So in data types, we will cover is text data type, numeric data type, then sequence, mapping, then set, and Boolean types. So until last session, what we have learned is regarding variables and string data type. Now we will move forward to numeric data type, which is just three types called as int, float, and complex. So now we'll go in deep about numeric data types. So numeric data types, as the name suggests, these data types are basically used for storing numbers into it. And those numbers can be either a whole number or a positive number or a negative number. And those numbers can contain decimals or without decimals. And the length of the digits can be like infinite. It's basically like 2 raised to 32 digits can be accustomed into a numeric data type. So if we go into deep now, like step by step, now the first one within numeric data type is called as int, which indicates integers in Python. So basically int indicates it will store integers into it. So what is an example for it, right? So example for int would be, let's say we have a variable called as x and we are storing a number 1 in it. Since 1 is integer, we are storing 1 into variable called as x. And in Python, if you just want to know, right, like what kind of data has been stored in variable x, we can do is print x, so that if we execute this command, we'll get part of the output as 1, which is an integer number. And to understand what type of data exactly it contains, type of data in variable, for that we will execute this type of command, type of x, and then it includes print. So if we execute this type of x as part of output, we will get is int, so that we know like this x variable is an integer type. Same way, the next one is called as float, which contains is numbers which contains decimals in it. Numbers which contains decimals in it. So example for it is, we can have another variable called as y, and it contains, let's say, 1.5. So now since the number contains decimal in it, which is zero point 0.5 in 1, which is 1.5, or this data type is called as float data type. And then again, like if you want to check what is the value present in this number y, what we'll do is print y, which will give me output as what is the value present in my variable y, which is 1.5. And then lastly, again, like if I need to check what type of data is stored in variable y, we will execute the same command, but instead of x, we will pass a y. So type of data in variable, which is type of y. And this will let us, as part of output, my output should be something like float in the message. Same way for my above one, what should be my output? Output should be list in the message. Sorry, integer in the message. So that you know like what kind of data is present in your variable and whether it's integer or float, we can get to know by using these functions, and print will give me the value which is contained in my variable. And then lastly is our complex number. So complex numbers you might have seen in your mathematical classes, like which is kind of a number which contains an imaginary part. So these are basically numbers which contains imaginary part. Now there is very less usage of complex numbers in Python programming. It's only used when you're trying to do some kind of mathematical calculations. Then only we'll be using complex numbers. But for vast majority of the times, we'll use only is floats or integers. But if we go forward now into complex number, what can be an example of a complex number? Example would be x equal to, let's say, 1 plus 5j. So if we go into basic structure of a complex number, the structure is number equal to a plus ij, where your first a is 1 and your I is this 5 and j is your imaginary part. And lastly, again, if you want to know what is the value which is present inside x, what I'll do is print x, and I should get whatever number which has been stored in variable x. And lastly, I want to know what is the type of the data. So I will do is type of data in variable will be type of x, and as part of my output I should see in the message as complex. So this covers all three numbers within Python. So first one is integers, then floats which contains decimals, and complex. Now the next important part within numbers is like conversions. So if example is like if I have a number which is 1.5 and I need to convert into an integer which is 1. So how do I convert from a float to integers or integer to float and vice versa? We cannot convert mostly from complex to float because the structure of number is always different. But we can convert between integer to float and float to integer and vice versa. So conversion of numbers. So let's take an example now. My x is, let's say, 1, then y is, let's say, 2.5, and let's take complex number also, which is z equal to 1 plus 5j. Now I need to do is conversion. Now convert from into float. So how do I do it? Converting an integer to float. So converting an integer to float can happen is like my output equal to float of my integer number. Now what is my integer number? My integer number is this x. So float of x will convert my x, which is an integer, to float. So what will be my output? My output would be looking something like 1.0. So since we converted an integer to a whole number, sorry, to a float number, your non-decimal number, which is 1, will be converted to have a decimal included in it, which is 1.0. Same way, we'll convert is from float to integer now. So now how do we convert from float to integer? Again, my output would be equal to int, and inside this int function, I will pass a float number, which is y. Now, since y over here is 2.5, my output should be converted to an integer, which means I will remove this 0.5 out of this 2.5 and my output should be just 2 without any decimal place. So these are the two ways where we can convert from integer to float and float to integer. And lastly, just a quick example for converting an integer to complex. We can do it same way, but it's not required for most of the time. So convert from int to complex. How do we do this? Output equal to, as we did for earlier ones, where we wanted to convert from int to float, we used a function called as float. Same way, when we converted from float to int, we used a function called as int. So here we'll use the function called as complex and passed our number, which is an integer, which is x. And this will convert my number from integer to complex. So this is how our conversion of number works. And that's all for like numbers section within Python. So I'll just take a pause of 2 seconds to understand like if you have any kind of questions or doubts. And if you don't have, then I can jump into a quick programming session for the numbers itself. So this is our console for Python where we'll like quickly execute some programs which won't be like complete programs, but to test out like how the numbers are seen in Python. So, okay. So as per our like theoretical, what we did was we took the integer first, right? Now, same way in our console, we'll test them out. So we were saying is regarding integers. So what we did is we declared a variable called as x and we stored a value which is integer in it. And what we did was we want to know what is the value exactly stored in this variable called as x. For that purpose, what we'll do is we'll do print x and we will execute it. Once I execute, I should see what is the value which is present in my variable x. So as soon as I execute it, you'll see a value which is 1 present in my x. And the next thing what we wanted to check was what type of variable x is it. So is it a integer or is it a float or a complex number? So that kind of message we'll see using the type syntax. So in type of x, if I just execute that way, I will not get a message here. If you see, what I'm getting is just the print, but this statement is not being seen here. So what I'll do is just print of type of x, and that print will tell me what is the type of my variable x or what type of data is present in my variable x. And I should see a message here which will tell like some integer or something. So if you see, this is of class int. So this way we get to know what is the exact value which is present in my value variable called as x. Check its value, check value in variable x and check type of data in x, which is integer. Same way, we'll check it for floats now. Now here, our y was 1.5. Similarly, we'll do is print y, and this should tell us what is the value which is present in my y. I see value is 1.5 here. And lastly, I'll again do a print type of y, and I should see a message which will tell me float because my y contains a float number. On execution, I see it is a class float. So that's how Python is telling us what type of data it is and what type of data it is for float also. And lastly, we'll check for complex number now. Let's say we have a complex number x equal to 1 plus 5j, and I do a print of x and I execute it. I'm seeing a complex number which is as it is 1 plus 5j. And lastly, again, type of my data present in x. And I should see something called as complex here. So this is how I'm seeing what is my expected output in the variables. So for now, what I'll do is quickly paste the output in our node so that we know what is the values in each of our examples when we ran in our console. So this is our output. Copy, paste. This would be our output from our consoles. Okay. So that whenever you are trying to refer the nodes, you'll understand like how the program was written and what was the output for each of these print statements. So similarly, I'll just do it for our floats. So float was also in the similar nature. Console output. Output. And lastly for our complex numbers. Now next thing what we'll do is we'll try to do exercises of converting the numbers which we learned here. Okay. So now we have learned these three numbers. Now we'll use these three variables again and we'll try to convert from integer to float and all these things. So if I just do a complete paste there, or this paste won't work. So let's do quickly. X was my 1, then Y is my 2.5, which is a float. and Z, which is my complex number, which is 1 plus 5j. Now what I need to do is convert from integer to float. And how do I do it is output is my variable name, output equal to float of x. And if I execute it, I should see my output here. Now why I'm not seeing output here is because only the value is stored in this output variable, but we are not printing that value. So once we print this variable, we should see the value. So here you see my x was 1 and I converted to a float, it became 1.0. So this is my output, which is nothing but the output which is shown here. Same way, what I need to do is convert from float to integer. How do I do it? Again, output equal to integer of my y. Now here my y contains a float, which is 2.5, and I'm converting into integer. And if I print that variable out, I should see my output, which is 2. Now you see your input was 2.5 and it has been converted to 2. So that zero point 0.5, which was the decimal number, has been excluded from your 2.5. And lastly, our conversion from integer to complex. Convert from integer to complex. And how do we do it is again like output equal to complex of my integer number, which is x. So here we are converting our int to a complex, and let's see how it looks like. So print out, and if I execute it, I'm seeing 1 plus 0j, which is in the structure of a complex number format. So that's how our output is looking like, which is 1 plus 0j. I'll just paste this program for our reference. Okay, so that completes our numbers section, and we learned about all the numbers within Python, all three number types and conversion between those numbers. As part of next part now, what we'll do is we'll move forward from our numbers to sequential list type, which are like list, tuple, and range. And then we'll move forward to dictionary now. So let's jump on sequence type.